Welcome everyone to the Property Journey podcast, Beginner to Expert. Myself and Roy are back again, and today's topic we are going to be talking about the rental market in Northern Ireland, and just in general as well. You'll be able to find some of these tips will also be helpful across all markets. So I've made a lot of notes. You're in for a bit of a grilling. Hopefully you'll be able to answer them all.
No problem at all.
We'll get stuck in. So obviously the first thing I wanted to talk about then is the overview and the current trends, and maybe not just Northern Ireland but across the rental market itself. Like, what sort of things have you seen in the market in terms of those trends and those?
In the rental market, you always, there's a continual number of people coming into the market, as in they're moving out of home. They're looking to get a new home, whether it means they're looking to rent or looking to buy. What we have seen in the last 3 to 4 years, we're seeing actually a lot of first time buyers getting younger and younger. So it used to be a lot of people rented early on in life, whereas now we're seeing first time buyers are getting younger as well.
And that's something that I was going to touch on. Is that kind of nearly like a first step for a lot of people? Is, I'm living with my parents, I want to move out, I maybe don't want to commit myself to a mortgage straight away, so the rental market is like the first step to see, can I basically sustain living in a home myself?
Yeah.
Would that be a fair assumption?
Yeah. Well, firstly, everybody always wants that stage in life. It just becomes that point in life where you want to move out of home, particularly if you haven't went to university or anything like that. So yes, the first and easy step is jumping into the rental market. It's fairly cost effective to get into it because a deposit for renting a house, you find a month's rent and that's your deposit, and then you find your first month's rent up front on top of that. And it could be something where you actually rent a house that is furnished, depending on the area. Sometimes that's quite a popular means to go down, so it actually can be very cost effective to get your own space. And
I suppose actually, as you say there, a month's rent compared to a deposit.
If you're buying a house, you're talking maybe 5%, 10%, so you could be looking at 17,000, 15,000. It's a considerable difference.
And like, are we seeing at the minute, because I do notice obviously when you read the news or there's constant maybe news articles and stuff like that there coming out about the rental market, is it becoming quite competitive for properties in terms of even renting? We've had discussions about how busy and competitive the housing market is if you're buying a house, but is the rental market the same? The rental market is very, very competitive at the minute.
There's a lot of people looking to rent, and there's not enough houses available for rent. So at the minute there's dozens upon dozens of people applying for the one property. So it's always best to you need to stand out from the crowd effectively. So if you can have good references, have your deposit, have two people maybe applying for the house, as in you and a partner rather than you by yourself, because that shows affordability. And very simply, be prepared. Have all your paperwork sitting ready, so that whenever a house comes up available, you can go and look at it, and you've got all your paperwork sitting ready, which means you're hitting the ground running.
Yeah. So I suppose when a landlord or whatever is obviously, or if it's through an agency or whoever's marketing basically the property, when they ask for those, you have it
all sitting there ready.
And I suppose if you have it sitting ready and you're able to put that to them straight away, there's a high chance they'll consider it, and you could be the lucky one snaps it up.
Exactly. Yeah.
And like, obviously if we're saying that it's becoming highly competitive, is it because there isn't enough properties? Is it more people's looking for it? Is there not enough landlords? Is there...
Yes, two points are actually in one without actually realising it. So yes, there's not enough properties, and probably the main reason for that is there's quite a few landlords have decided over the last couple of years maybe it's time to get out of the market. Quite a few people have got out of the market simply because they were what's known as accidental landlords. They had bought properties during the last boom. They've then been sitting with them during the last crash, so they've been sitting with those houses since maybe 2007. They didn't want to be landlords. The house prices have got back up to well past to what they paid for them, and they just now want out of the market. So where a lot of those property owners, those houses have been sold, and quite a few of them probably have been bought up by home owners. So that has reduced the number of properties available then for people to rent. And then when you add on to that with a growing population, and we're hitting the next batch of young adults moving out of home looking to rent, so when you combine the two together, that creates a shortage of houses.
So like obviously I wanted to talk about then obviously the pros and cons of renting compared to home ownership. There's obviously some people that are more than happy if they have to rent the rest of their life, they're happy doing that. Some people are renting maybe at the minute but want to move into home ownership. Is there pros and cons between each of them? Obviously I suppose a lot of it boils down to personal circumstance.
It's completely personal. Everybody has everybody has their own desires. So for instance, very briefly to run through the difference, so the benefits of renting a house, we've already said it, you don't have to worry about a large deposit. You can actually move from house to house. You can maybe setup costs are a lot less. You can maybe get a house that is already furnished. Your maintenance costs are a lot lower. So if there's a plumbing issue or a maintenance issue, a landlord is generally going to cover that for you. The downsides to renting is that you don't know how long are you going to actually have the house for. You might have a tenancy. Generally it's for 6 months or 12 months. But after that 6 or 12 months, there's no guarantee that you're actually going to remain in that property. So, there's a lot of uncertainty there. And then also sometimes there's the gripe with, will a landlord actually repair things that's wrong with the property? And you're left in a property that's maybe faulty heating or cold or damp or anything like that. Compare that to owning your own property. It's everybody's dream and vision to own their own house. It's an asset that you're working every month, that you're paying money into something that is actually yours. You can then put your own stamp on the property. So if you want to paint it, you can paint it. If you want to change the kitchen, you can do that. Whereas in a rental property, you can't do that. And then ultimately, it's a property then that if the property prices rise, you're gaining off the back of it, and it could be something you either cash in, you have extra money, or you simply move to a different area, bigger house, and just keep progressing that way.
Just to touch on the point obviously that you made there about excuse me, doing up or painting a rental property or whatever, you could go ahead maybe and do that. Your landlord's probably going to be more than happy for you to do that.
Generally you have to ask for their permission first of all, yes.
But if you're doing that, you're doing up essentially someone else's home.
Yeah, you're potentially adding value to somebody else's property.
So I suppose it's a sticky situation. You want it to be as nice as possible, but if the landlord's not going to do anything and you decide to, you're doing it off your own back, and potentially for someone to move in 6 months time or 12 months time. I suppose then when you balance it out, a rental property allows that flexibility, as you said. If you're maybe in a house that you're not particularly happy with, once your lease is up, you can move on and choose somewhere else to live. A mortgage is obviously tying you down, but then you're tied to what you can do.
Yeah.
In terms of a rental property, whereas if you own your house or you're currently paying the mortgage in your house, it's up to you to do what you want, and it gives you that option. I suppose then there's a number of challenges faced by renters then, in terms of like rising costs, limited supply I've noted down, and obviously then the competition. Is this now, especially with interest rates rising, inflation's obviously high, landlords are now facing higher costs, and that could be from whether it's their mortgage or also then maintenance. These types of things are now beginning to rise. Is this why it's having such a severe impact on renters?
There's a number of factors at the minute which are pushing up rents. So the shortage is worse is one thing, first of all. So obviously if there's a shortage, some landlords can see that and the advantage, and they put the price up. Also, if they have a better product, they feel as if then, well, if there's a better product, they've invested more money in the property, or ask for more rent as well. inflation, so the cost of living has increased as well, so that's an add-on impact into it. And then also, yes, interest rates are going up, so the investor or the landlord, their mortgage is potentially increasing every month, increasing as the interest rates have increased recently, and then therefore they're trying to claw back that by increasing the rent. So for instance, over the last 6 months, rents have risen phenomenally. Very briefly, a property, I'm thinking of a 2-bedroom property in Portadown could have went from maybe £475 per month. That could be going for as much as £625 a month at the minute. So it's a significant increase in the last 12 months.
Like, you're probably chatting there, if I'm doing roughly about a 25%, 30% increase on rent.
Yeah.
And I suppose off the top of my head, and I don't want you to quote figures here or anything like that there, but in terms of the rent on a property now compared to potentially a mortgage, is there much of a difference? You know,
it is actually, it's quite difficult to work out off the top of my head. In theory and on average, generally the cost of owning a property should be lower than what it is to rent a property, and normally that is also when you're factoring in with paying your rates as well for the property. But certainly if you speak to a mortgage advisor, they'll run through the figures with you on that. It's quite difficult to say at the minute because the interest rates, the banks have maybe increased their rates at the minute because they're not quite sure, are the Bank of England going to go again or they're not. So it's a wee bit, knocked out of the usual sync at the minute. But just to throw a curveball in, you could also consider co-ownership, which is a government-backed scheme which allows you to buy a house with a smaller deposit, and that can also work out more cost effective compared to renting a property as well.
I think I've actually, I don't know where we are, probably going slightly off topic here, but that co-ownership, that's essentially where the government owns.
So you work out a percentage as to how much money you can put into it, and it could be something whereby it's a government scheme. They maybe own 50% of the house, you own 50%, or it can be 60-40. It can literally be any percentage that's worked out. But it's a very cost effective way of getting onto the property market with little or no deposit. There are opportunities when you can buy a house without actually putting down any deposit.
I suppose that's probably a new topic that we could discuss at a later date. We'll maybe not get too much into that, but I do remember I'd read quite a bit about co-ownerships, and I do know that they are becoming quite popular now in terms of, and because obviously the younger generation, I suppose I could even describe it as my generation, are probably struggling to get on to the property market because of how high the costs are. And well, another point actually to talk about, and again we're completely off topic here, but I was watching a Martin Lewis video. It's maybe 3 days ago, and he was discussing about people waiting on interest rates to come down because 0.5% was the new norm, and what he was trying to say was they may come down, but if you look at the graph over 100 years, the last 10 years has been such a big anomaly that we can't expect it to go back down to 0.5%. So it kind of, I think we touched on it in the last podcast, that it was 5% is kind of the average
for a good economy. It's 5%,
which is where we're currently at. So we kind of nearly need to gear ourselves around to, well, this is what it's going to be. And if we're really going to go for it, then you've got to understand that 5% interest rates is where it's going to be, and not rely on it to drop down. Now,
it's just your cost of living just has to be tweaked. Back years ago, whenever I was looking about buying the first home, your main priority was your mortgage and paying for your house, paying for your car, and then anything that you had left over was basically your luxuries, going out for a bite to eat, getting a coffee, your clothes, things like that. We have maybe been spoilt over the last 5 years or so with costs being so low, whereby we had maybe too many luxuries, going out every day for lunch, going out every day for coffees. So unfortunately, we need to maybe swing that back a wee bit, and if you do that, it should make owning a house, a bit more affordable.
And I suppose the thing about it is, as well, is that you could maybe go down and, for example, a bag of chips used to be £1.10 or £1.20. It's maybe £4.50 now.
Yeah.
So the cost of everything has increased, and obviously now, because the interest rates and mortgage rates were so low, now that they've increased, everything else had already increased. It's kind of now finding that, maybe we didn't see the prices of everything else gradually increasing over the last 10 years. Now that mortgages have finally went up, it's kind of hitting home now.
Yeah.
And as you say, them luxuries aren't affordable anymore. And
there were luxuries that became part of a normal life, which probably, I'm going to sound a bit boring here, but unfortunately they have to become, rather than the normal day-to-day enjoyments, to more so luxuries. You could go around in circles as well, and discussing. You do hear a lot of people saying about, cancel your Netflix, subscription or whatever. But when you weigh it up, that $10.99 a month or whatever probably isn't really going to make that much of an impact on the direction that you're trying to head. There's different things, I suppose, that you could look at, and it's really probably honing in on where the most cost is going out. Because, as I say, a $10.99 Netflix subscription isn't going to make that big of a hole. I've read a lot of people saying that it's basically you have to go by what your income is rather than different areas. So to get back on the topic, which was the rental market and not co-ownerships and everything else, I wanted to discuss kind of the tenant rights and responsibilities. We'll maybe not go too much into it, but it was more looking at those lease agreements as you were discussing, the likes of what your deposits are, where does maintenance fall. From a tenant's perspective in the rental market, those lease agreements, that's essentially up to the landlord to set them, but where does the tenant fall into that? So generally, a lot of landlords and a lot of agents would use like a standard template of a lease, and the in practical terms or in legal terms, the tenant would pay a deposit, which is normally equivalent to 1 month's rent. That's paid up front, and that's protected in a government scheme. So it's kept away from the landlord, kept away from the tenant, and it's shielded. That is there to protect the landlord in the future, for instance, from maybe rent arrears or damages to the property, and that's looked at the end of the tenancy. I can come back to that very shortly. You then normally sign a tenancy which is either for 6 months or 12 months. It's unusual to sign a tenancy that's any longer than that. So that normally locks the tenant in and locks the landlord in for that period of time. So in theory, if it's a 12-month tenancy, that's you cannot move out of that property within the first 12 months. For responsibilities in the property, the landlord in theory is only responsible for the likes of the structure, so the likes of the outside walls, the roofs, and the mains water, mains electric, and main heating for the property. In theory, it should be, like if a door handle breaks or those wee small things, or cupboard door breaks, strictly speaking, that should be a tenant is responsible for that. Although we just have become accustomed whereby tenants then pass that on and expect the landlords to do that. The maintenance of a property, the inside of it, it is up to the tenant to maintain that. So keep the walls nice and clean and fresh. If they want to decorate it, they can decorate it. But anything that they do to the property, they have to get the permission of the landlord. If they do something that doesn't get permission from the landlord, then that deposit that I talked about earlier is at risk. Once the tenant then leaves the property, then at that point they have to leave the property back to the state and the condition that they found it, except for general wear and tear. So general wear and tear would be a couple of marks maybe on a wall or a bit of dirt on the carpets, not completely holes in the carpets and chunks out of the walls sort of things. If you don't leave the property back in that similar condition, then that deposit is at risk of being forfeited, either part of it or all of it. And likewise, if your rent isn't paid up to date as well, then that deposit can be taken as part of the money due to the landlord. On that note, some tenants think that that deposit is basically it's capped, so that if there's more damage or anything, well, that deposit covers it. But no, it's only that amount of money. The landlord can pursue you for even more money, for more damages, more losses, if that is the case.
So, for example, if my deposit or what the was it sitting in that pot was, say, for example, £400, but the carpet was completely ruined and it was maybe going to cost £1,500.
Yes.
They can come after me for the rest of the money then to cover that.
Yes.
And because I suppose when you hear a lot of chat about landlords and they're taking deposit monies because of small amounts of damage and stuff like this here, like, is there protection in there from a tenant's perspective? You know, what can a tenant do to kind of make sure that the property stays up to the standard so that they know they can get that deposit back at the end of that lease agreement?
Well, a tenant and a landlord can both be protected by way of like a check-in condition report. So that can either be done, it should be done by the agent, or it can be done by the landlord, which basically means that, you know, photos are taken of the property. It maybe points out if there's a damage already caused by a previous tenant, and that's all photographic evidence to show that this was the condition of the property before the tenant moved in. You do the exact same sort of a report once the tenant moves out, and there's your two comparisons. Yeah. And then you've got a third party arbitration company, so the deposit scheme company that holds the money, they're the folks who then actually decide. So for instance, once a tenant moves out, you can either negotiate between the landlord and tenant directly to say, right, well, this is how much you're getting, is that agreed? And if that's agreed, everybody walks on. If it's not agreed, then it goes to arbitration within that tenancy deposit scheme. They look at the evidence that's provided to them by the landlord, they look at the evidence provided to them by the tenant, and they take a non-biased approach, and they make a decision. And on that point, they make that decision as to who gets what of the deposit, and then it's returned after that.
And whenever it was, obviously, you know, as I said before in the first episode, I'm the beginner, so I'm kind of learning as I go along beside you. So I was reading about renter's insurance. Is there such a thing, or
well, your insurance is really, renter's insurance is really only going to be covering the contents of the property. So say for instance, you know, your table, your chairs, your sofas, your electrical goods, your you know, iPad and different things like that, so that if there's a leak in the property, maybe there's a flood in the property, maybe there's a fire, a burglary, anything like that, that would cover those items that technically wouldn't be covered by the landlord's insurance. A landlord is only compelled to have buildings insurance. So that means if a house burns down, well, the landlord should have insurance to rebuild the property, but unfortunately everything that was inside the property is gone. Yeah. So that's why it's best for a tenant to have insurance in place to cover those items.
So essentially, as you say there, then the landlord's kind of buildings insurance. The renter themselves should have contents insurance for themselves and any of the possessions that they have then.
Yeah.
Because that's why I was curious, because I was reading and I was doing bits and pieces, and the next one it flashed up and it was kind of, I must ask Roy what that was covering. So finding the right property, there's obviously lots of websites out there now. There's different agents, estate agents are obviously advertising rental properties. Some of them potentially have landlords, you know, management. Mm-hmm. They're looking after the management of the properties as well within the estate agent. Is there I suppose there's no real best way to go and try and find a rental property?
Finding a rental property is no different actually finding a property that you're going to buy. So it's all advertised through the same platforms. Mm-hmm. And likewise, you can do it the manual way by going around each estate agent and saying, you know, let's take a look at what you have, or you simply go to the search engine platforms that will cover a whole wide area, and you simply go, you view it, you take a look at it, you check the area, does it suit your needs, and you put your application in for it.
So essentially the same way as what you would do with buying a house, you kind of go through your checklist, find out that whether or not you maybe need schools, or what's in the local area around you. Is there enough shops? Are you close to home? Or you know, all that kind of stuff then. And then find the property that you want, and you're back into potentially a competition. They try and secure the property. Obviously once you've done that and you find the property that you want, you touched on making sure you had all your paperwork. So like kind of what's involved in those applications? Like obviously there's credit checks, there's I'd noted down then obviously your references from previous landlords.
Some agents maybe have a different type of vetting process. Some are maybe very detailed, others maybe not as detailed, but just briefly, some of the things that you would need would be, you need to immediately show that you can pay the deposit and you can pay the first month's rent. So if you had like a bank statement to show, here's my savings, or you know, here's my credit union, here we go, no problem at all. You need to show your address, so where you living at the minute. So if you're living at home or if you're living in a rental property, you have a bank statement or a utility bill to show that, your ID documents to back that up as well. Proof of employment. It's always good to maybe have 6 months, maybe 12 months pay slips, so that a landlord or an agent can very quickly flick through and see that actually yes, this person has been employed for quite a long time and they are sustainable. Proof of ID, proof of address, proof of funds is what's needed, and references. So say for instance, if you have rented before, a landlord reference would be good to show that you've paid your rent, you've looked after the property. That sometimes can be very difficult to get because maybe a landlord isn't keen on providing it. A very simple solution would be just search or print out all your bank statements and simply highlight your rent payments for the last 12 months or the last 24 months, and very simply you can show bang on you've paid your rent exactly to the date that is due for the last 12 months, and that's that you're reliable. One thing which can maybe throw a few people off applications, and that is pets. So it's a difficult topic to talk around because you're either a pet lover or you're not a pet lover, and I think that's what it comes down to. Some landlords have maybe had good experiences with pets, and some have had very, very bad experience with pets. So I would say on average, if you were to carry out a survey, I would say it's easier to find a property if you don't have a pet compared to if you do have a pet.
Well, that's something I'm going to come on to because I was doing a bit of research about it, and it's a topic that's actually currently being discussed in the government with new legislation, so I'll touch on that. But there was one of the topics that I wanted to go back to was in terms of if I go through an agent, for example, that agent is representing the landlord. So if I put my application in, the agent themselves maybe isn't making the decision, are they? It could potentially be the agents collecting all the information on the behalf of the landlord, and it's up to the landlord themselves to make the final decision. Would that be a correct assumption as well? That's
where a lot of disgruntle can come in between a renter making an application and getting a property. So an agent is generally just summarising that information for the landlord, and they may go as far as making a recommendation, but ultimately it is the landlord who makes a decision. Now there might be times where the landlord says to the agent, yep, just work away, make that choice, but normally it's the landlord who makes that decision or has that authority to make the decision. So if you haven't been chosen or you haven't been picked, it's not down to the agent. The agent shouldn't be blamed or can't be blamed. It's the landlord, and it could just simply be, it's just maybe one wee thing has just knocked the landlord out of making that decision.
It could be because that's what I mean. As we've already discussed, the competition's high, and therefore, if the competition's high and there's been a lot of applications, it simply could be a choice of there's 5 people here and it's luck of the draw.
Could be.
It's just essentially whatever one kind of hits the top of the pile, I'm going to go for that
toss
one.
Of a coin,
So because that's where I've seen it as well, that a lot of people say about agents and what way they operate, but it essentially is nearly like a front between the renter themselves and the landlord, and they're the kind of contact agency between the two to make sure that everything's kind of running smoothly.
Yeah.
Just wanted to make sure that I was right in that. So like in terms of the lease agreements, and we've talked kind of briefly on lease agreements and stuff, but like what way can you say, for example, you're in a property, you really like it, you're tied into a 12 months tenancy, like is there options to renew that? Like kind of what way does a renter in terms of like lease terms have? As you said, 6 months, 12 months is usually the basic, but like where does a renter stand when they're negotiating a potential new lease, or if maybe the landlord themselves thinks I've got some good tenants here, I kind of want to keep them, could I offer them a longer tenancy? Are those options, or
there's no exact science? It's all down to knowing your opponent. So from a tenant point of view, you could open up that negotiations a couple of months before your tenancy expires, or you wait until the tenancy expires. It could be something where you maybe negotiate, say you automatically go to the landlord and say, I'll increase my rent to this amount if you lock me in for 2 years, or if you lock me in for 3 years, for instance. From a landlord's point of view, again, depends what their opinion is. It might be their strategy might be just to maximise the rent and they'll just put it up. It might be the case where they think to themselves, you know what, that's a good tenant I have in there, I don't want any hassle of going through re-renting it, getting it ready, maybe just keep the rent as the same and just let it tick on. So there's completely no science to it.
I suppose there's certain landlords out there, as you say, want to maximise it. There's other ones want stability, and therefore
easy life.
So if they can have a property where the tenant's happy, they're happy doing what they're doing around that house, and they're getting a fairly decent average rent. With no questions asked, I'm sure that a lot of tenants or landlords would be quite happy with that as well. So it really probably is up for discussion. As you say, about 2 months before sort of the...
Generally, yes, because it gives you a bit of time then, so that maybe unfortunately if things don't work out and the tenancy isn't being renewed, well then you've got time then to start looking for somewhere else.
Back to the pets. I was reading and I think it is only England specific, and I think it was only being discussed in May of this year, was the Renters Reform Bill, which is set, if I get my head around this right, is set to allow pets. It's essentially to stop people from saying no, advertising no pets. Renters would be allowed with pets to come in and obviously agree tenancy, but if there's any damage, and I'm going to try and make sure that I get this right, if there was any damage caused within the property by the pets, it is covered by insurance.
That might be something that's been discussed in England. It's going to be slightly different to here, but you normally find things generally happen in England first, and then they will progress through to...
Well, that's what I was going to just say here. That it is only England. That's why I made that point, that people don't think that in Northern Ireland that it's happening. As you say, it could be 5 years, or the way things are 10 years.
It's probably more down the line at the minute, more on a discrimination side of things, whereby a landlord could be held accountable in Northern Ireland. It's very difficult. Sometimes some landlords openly will say that they don't want any applications from anybody on benefits. Those sorts of things can be very difficult, and that can open a landlord up to discrimination.
Yeah. And that's what it was, only because that was the point that I was trying to say, was that a lot of people are obviously disappointed when they maybe see a house that they really like, and it's clearly the landlord is clearly saying no pets, and they've maybe got a small dog, or a dog that's reasonably harmless, whatever, quite well trained, whatever it happens to be, and clearly they're just not getting an option there. So I think this kind of was coming in to maybe allow for, look, you know, this is your pet or whatever. If anything happens within the property, the insurance will take over. And I think it was gonna. I need to do a bit more reading on it, but it was coming in alongside the renter's insurance, which I think that's where I picked that up. So it was to fall in under that bracket as well. So it'd be interesting to keep an eye on that, you know, coming across if it does maybe come to Northern Ireland. I don't even think it's went through in England yet, but they're definitely talking about it.
But a renter, you know, to be ahead of the game, you need to think outside the box. So that could be something that a renter actually says to a landlord, right, okay, if I've ticked all the boxes but I'm falling down on the pet issue, well, yes, I'll take out an insurance policy. They could say I'll maybe double up my deposit or treble up my deposit. You could go down the guarantor route, or ultimately say, come and inspect my current property.
Yes.
You know, like for instance, I've rented houses, I've managed houses for investors for years. I've come across both sides of the spectrum. I've come across houses where tenants have pets, and those houses are absolutely immaculate, spotless, tidier than anybody's house. But unfortunately, likewise, I've seen the other side of it, where I've seen houses which have been completely destroyed with pets. You know, the skirting boards chewed off, you know, the claw marks, carpets having to be replaced, just dirty and destroyed. I've seen it all.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Like, you know, and I want to make sure that we get this across, that we're on no side here either. We're kind of, you know, we're only here to discuss the way things currently are, and it's a difficult one because, you know, again, it's up to the owners. It's up to the owners, one, of the pets, but two, of, you know, the property themselves. They've put a lot of money into, you know, buying that house, maybe doing it up, making sure that it looks nice. And if you've got a pet coming in that's just going to completely destroy that, well, you know, would you really want a pet in there? And there's two sides to the coin. As you say, a landlord could be extremely pet friendly, loves animals, and they're kind of going, well, go ahead, you know, I'm happy enough with it. So it really is kind of up to the discretion of that landlord. And then obviously, as you say, from a renter's perspective, how you put it across as well. You know, if you've ticked all the boxes and it gets to that final point, well then, you know, open that discussion and explain it, and 9 times out of 10 you might be able to change the mindset. So I just wanted to then touch back then about the rental market in Northern Ireland then. Like, is there certain things, as you say then, like what would kind of be nearly the top tips of what you should kind of be doing if you're looking to rent a property? You know, is it a case of get your paperwork, everything kind of
pick probably 2 to 3 areas that you're willing to move, you know, to live in, and I'm talking about maybe not only in one town but maybe other towns, because that'll open up your availability of properties. Next of all, then have your paperwork in place, and thirdly, have your money sitting ready, because a lot of people look about renting a house but they maybe don't have a deposit. And maybe fourth of all, maybe just to have a backup, is maybe have a guarantor behind you as well, and have all that paperwork sitting ready, so that you're sitting there basically on top of the game. Yeah. Well, that's me. I've run out of my notes now, so I don't really want to go into any more topics. As I says, there's probably the flip side that we could very easily go into, which is going to be, you know, from a landlord's perspective, and maybe get involved in the rental market, as in, I own a property, I now want to be able to rent it out. But we'll maybe save that for another episode as well, along with the co-ownership and everything else that we kind of went into there. But I think that'll do us for this week's episode, and that's should be a very good basic introduction to the rental market. So thank you very much, Roy. Thank you, Chris.
Everyone else, if you want to give us all a follow on the Property Journey podcast, Beginner to Expert, we are currently, from what I believe, on the majority of streaming platforms where you find your Google Podcasts, and Spotify, YouTube as well. So stay tuned. There'll be lots more episodes coming up very, very soon. And as I said, we'll get into plenty more topics over the next while.
Perfect. Thank you.